The drawing-room of Thornfield Manor glowed with the amber warmth of a winter fire, its light dancing across silk wallpaper the color of old roses. Outside, snow fell in the peculiar silence of Christmas Eve, transforming the Cotswolds landscape into something that looked, as Miss Marple often thought, precisely like the illustrations in a children's storybook. Inside, however, the atmosphere was considerably less picturesque. The Ashworth family's annual Christmas Eve gathering had begun, as it did every year, with the same mixture of genuine affection and barely concealed tensions that Miss Marple had come to recognize in nearly every family she had encountered in her long and observant life. She sat in her favorite chair near the fire, a small woman of considerable age, dressed in dove gray with her silver hair pinned neatly back, and she watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. Though most people assumed she was merely dozing over her knitting, the hosts, Edmund and Patricia Ashworth, had invited some 24 guests to their home, which sprawled across several acres of the village of Thornfield, a place so quintessentially English that it seemed almost impossible that anything truly dreadful could occur there. Edmund was a retired banker, some 65 years of age, with the confident bearing of a man who had made decisions about other people's money for 40 years and suffered no apparent anxiety about it. His wife Patricia, some 10 years younger, had that particular kind of beauty that comes from confidence and good breeding rather than any striking features. Their son, Gregory, a man of 38, worked in London in some capacity that nobody quite understood but which involved enough money to justify his somewhat superior attitude toward those of lesser means. His wife, Sylvia, was considerably younger, perhaps 28, with the sort of restless energy that made Miss Marple wonder if the marriage was as contented as it appeared on the surface. Then there was Julian Hartley, the family's closest friend and Edmund's business partner for many years. He was a widower, his wife having died some 5 years previous, and he had rather moved into the Ashworth household with the ease of someone stepping into an old well-fitting shoe. He was always impeccably dressed, always perfectly charming, and yet Miss Marple had noticed that his eyes, when he thought nobody was observing, held a kind of permanent sadness that suggested depths others did not perceive. His daughter Catherine, who was Gregory's age, had recently inherited her mother's substantial fortune and had taken up residence in a cottage on the village outskirts, where she had begun what she called a quiet life of artistic contemplation, though the local shopkeeper had confided to Miss Marple that Catherine seemed to spend most of her time gardening with unusual intensity. The remaining guests consisted of various village fixtures and friends of the family. Margaret Thompson, the wife of the vicar, known for her charitable work and her rather uncharitable tendency to observe everyone else's affairs with suspicious interest, Dr. Raymond Price, the village physician, who had brought his younger brother Michael, a man whom Miss Marple had noted seemed to have recently acquired more expensive habits than his apparent income could support, and Dorothy Marsh, the Ashworths' long-time housekeeper, who was present during the evening in her capacity as both servant and family confidant. It was a gathering, Miss Marple had decided within the first hour, that contained all the ingredients for drama, though she could not have precisely articulated why she felt so certain of. It was simply that her many years of observing human nature had taught her to recognize when certain elements aligned: ambition, resentment, desire, and the sort of casual cruelty that people inflicted upon one another without even realizing they were doing so. The evening had proceeded in the traditional fashion. There had been a sumptuous dinner, during which the conversation had ranged across topics both trivial and significant. Miss Marple had noted several exchanges that struck her as noteworthy. Gregory had made a rather cutting remark about Julian's business acumen, suggesting that it was fortunate Edmund had been the one doing the real thinking during their partnership. Julian had smiled and said nothing, but his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. Later, Sylvia had asked Catherine about her new cottage in a voice that suggested genuine curiosity, but Catherine had responded with such deliberate coolness that Miss Marple wondered if there was some history between the two women of which she was unaware. Michael Price had spent most of the meal looking at Patricia Ashworth with an intensity that suggested either romantic interest or significant debt, possibly both. And Edmund, the patriarch of this gathering, had presided over everything with the benevolent authority of a man accustomed to command, though Miss Marple had noticed that his hand occasionally trembled slightly as he raised his wine-glass. After dinner, they had gathered in the drawing-room for the traditional Christmas Eve entertainment. There was caroling, though off-key, and performed with more enthusiasm than ability. There were parlor games, the sort of harmless amusements that family gatherings required. There was mulled wine and Christmas cake, and the pervasive sense of obligation that Christmas itself seemed to impose upon people, regardless of their actual feelings toward one another. Or the season. Miss Marple had won a game of charades despite barely participating, which seemed to amuse everyone, and she had exchanged pleasantries with those who approached her chair throughout the evening. She knitted steadily through it all, her needles creating a soft, rhythmic click that somehow seemed to make people talk more freely in her presence, as if they believed her attention was divided between her work and their words, and therefore she was less likely to retain what they said. Miss Marple, of course, retained everything. It was some few minutes before midnight when the mood of the gathering shifted. Edmund had announced that he would be retiring early, that the excitement of Christmas preparations had exhausted him more than usual, and he had excused himself from the drawing-room with Patricia attending him, concerned in that automatic way that long-married wives often were about their husbands' health. The clock on the mantelpiece had shown 1:55. The remaining guests had settled into a slightly more relaxed atmosphere once the patriarch had departed, conversations becoming more animated, slightly more candid. Julian had been discussing his recent trip to Italy, Catherine had been stifling a yawn, and Miss Marple was preparing to suggest that perhaps she herself should retire early, when Gregory had suddenly excused himself to fetch something from Edmund's study, a book he claimed his father had mentioned wanting to discuss. Gregory had been gone for perhaps 3 minutes when the scream came from upstairs, a sound so raw and genuine that it cut through the cheerful noise of the drawing-room like a blade through silk. Patricia's voice, wordless but unmistakably anguished. Everyone had frozen for a moment, and then Gregory had appeared at the drawing-room door, his face drained of all color, and had said in a voice that did not sound, like his own, that something dreadful had happened, that they must call the doctor immediately, that Edmund was not breathing. Miss Marple had observed, in that terrible moment as everyone rushed toward the stairs, that Michael Price had not moved from his chair for a full 3 seconds before rising to follow the others. She had also noticed that Julian Hartley's hand, which had been holding a glass of wine, had trembled so significantly that several drops had fallen to the carpet, and she had made a mental note that Catherine's first instinct had been not to rush toward the crisis, but to exchange a long, meaningful glance with her father before rising slowly and following the others. These were small things, barely noticeable in the chaos and confusion that followed, but they were precisely the sort of small things that Miss Marple had learned, over many years, usually meant a great deal indeed. The village of Thornfield, like most small English communities, operated according to an efficient system of communication that put official channels to shame. By dawn on Christmas morning, nearly every resident within a 5-mile radius knew that Edmund Ashworth had died under circumstances that were, at the very least, unusual. The constable, a competent but methodical man named Henwick, had arrived at Thornfield Manor shortly after midnight, followed within the hour by Dr. Pritchard, the county medical examiner, a thin, precise man with the bearing of someone who had seen far too much of human mortality to be surprised by any particular instance of it. Miss Marple, who had not retired despite the late hour, had remained in the drawing-room nursing a cup of tea while the household descended into the particular chaos that death brings to any gathering, no matter how prepared one might think oneself to be. She had watched as people came and went, as Patricia Ashworth was led away in a state of shock as the local police began their preliminary observations. She had listened to the various theories that were being proposed with increasing confidence by those who felt that proximity to tragedy gave them authority to speculate about its causes. The consensus that emerged in those first hours of investigation was remarkably swift and, Miss Marple suspected, remarkably wrong. Edmund Ashworth had suffered a massive heart attack. That was the preliminary medical assessment. He had been alone in his bedroom, Patricia having left him to rest after coming downstairs to join the gathering. He had apparently been in good spirits during dinner, though perhaps slightly overtired. His heart, when Dr. Pritchard examined it, appeared to have simply ceased functioning, as hearts, especially those of men of Edmund's age and general constitution, sometimes did. There was nothing suspicious about it. There was nothing to suggest that anything other than natural causes had claimed him. Constable Henwick had taken statements from everyone present, a formality really, since nobody had heard anything amiss, and the doctor had suggested that Edmund had likely died sometime between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. A tragic event, certainly, but not a criminal one. The constable had filed his report accordingly, and the machinery of grief had begun to grind forward. What was fascinating to Miss Marple, watching from her position near the fire where she had remained through much of the early morning, was not what the police had concluded, but what they had failed to observe. Patricia Ashworth, genuinely shocked and genuinely grieving though she appeared to be, had nevertheless composed herself with remarkable speed once the immediate crisis had passed. She had made telephone calls to arrange for the undertaker, had begun organizing the practical matters that death requires, had moved with the efficiency of someone who had perhaps rehearsed such events in her mind beforehand. This was not necessarily suspicious, Miss Marple knew. Some people simply responded to crisis with competence rather than hysteria. And yet Patricia's composure had something calculated about it, a quality that suggested emotion held firmly in check rather than naturally absent. Gregory had been quite a different case. Edmund's son had remained in a state of considerable agitation throughout the early hours, his face flushed, his manner nervous, his conversation somewhat frantic. He had spoken to his wife Sylvia in tones barely above a whisper, exchanges that Miss Marple could not quite hear but which seemed to involve some degree of disagreement or anxiety. He had made several telephone calls to London, urgent-sounding conversations about business matters that Miss Marple found curious, given that his father had only just died. The impression one gained was of a man worried about practical matters rather than genuinely grieving, though Miss Marple had learned long ago that grief expressed itself differently in different people, and the absence of overt emotion was not necessarily the absence of authentic feeling. Julian Hartley, meanwhile, had removed himself almost entirely from the proceedings. He had offered his condolences to Patricia in appropriately formal tones, had answered the constable's questions with precision and brevity, and had then retreated to the library, where he remained with the door closed for most of the morning. When he did emerge, it was to make a telephone call from the hall, a conversation conducted in such low tones that the content was impossible to discern, though his agitation was evident from his posture and the fact that his hand shook visibly as he replaced the telephone receiver. Catherine Hartley had displayed what might be described as philosophical acceptance of the situation. She had expressed appropriate sympathy for her father's evident distress, had answered the constable's questions thoroughly and without apparent evasion, and had then occupied herself by helping Dorothy Marsh, the housekeeper, with the various practical matters that the house now required. What was interesting, Miss Marple thought, was that Catherine had seemed unsurprised by Edmund's death. Most people, when confronted with the unexpected demise of someone they had known and associated with regularly, displayed at least a moment of shock. Catherine had received the news with a kind of calm acceptance that suggested, perhaps, that she had half expected something of this nature to occur, though she could hardly have anticipated the precise manner or timing. The Price brothers presented their own peculiarities. Dr. Price, as the resident physician, had attempted to take some medical authority over the proceedings, though Dr. Pritchard had politely but firmly established that the county examiner's judgment would prevail in matters of medical determination. Michael Price had remained largely silent, his initial shock apparently giving way to a kind of withdrawn contemplation. He had spoken to nobody unless directly addressed, and his responses had been minimal and colorless. Miss Marple had observed him standing near the window in the early morning light, staring out at the snow-covered gardens with an expression that suggested either profound grief or profound relief, and she rather suspected it was the latter, though she would not have wagered significantly on which. Margaret Thompson, the vicar's wife, had arrived at Thornfield Manor by mid-morning, ostensibly to offer her services and comfort to the bereaved family, though in reality Miss Marple knew she had come to gather information that would ensure. She could provide an accurate and detailed account of events to the village at large. The vicar's wife possessed that particular talent that some people had for expressing sympathy while simultaneously extracting every possible detail of interest from any situation. She had spent considerable time with Patricia, had asked numerous questions about Edmund's health and recent state of mind, had inquired with theatrical concern about whether there had been any warning signs that something might be amiss. Patricia had answered these questions with varying degrees of directness, but what struck Miss Marple was not what Patricia said, but what she did not say. She did not mention that Edmund had seemed worried in recent weeks. She did not reference any health concerns beyond the normal minor complaints of a man of his age. She did not suggest in any fashion that his death had been anticipated or feared. By afternoon on Christmas Day, the preliminary investigation had been concluded. Edmund Ashworth had died of a heart attack, brought on, the medical examiner suggested, by the excitement and exertion of hosting the Christmas Eve gathering. It was unfortunate timing, tragic for his family, but not unexpected in a man of his age and constitution. The body would be released to the undertaker after the formal paperwork had been completed. There would be a funeral service in a few days' time. Life, despite the interruption of death, would gradually return to its normal rhythms. Most people seemed satisfied with this conclusion. The case, as Constable Henwick had indicated with evident relief, was closed. It was only Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her chair with her knitting, who continued to contemplate the events of the previous evening with the sort of methodical concentration that suggested she believed the truth of what had occurred was considerably more complicated than Agnew. Nay else seemed willing to consider. The funeral service took place on the 28th of December, 3 days after Christmas, in the small stone church of St. Michael's that overlooked the village of Thornfield from its position on the hillside. The day was cold and grey, the sky the colour of old pewter, and the wind carried the kind of moisture that suggested more snow might be coming before nightfall. The church was packed with the sort of crowd that attends the funerals of the wealthy and established, people who had business connections with the deceased. Members of various committees and organizations upon which Edmund had served, and a generous sprinkling of those who came simply because the funeral of a prominent person was one of the more interesting events that occurred in a village during the winter months. Miss Marple sat near the back, as was her custom at such events, and she observed the gathering with the sort of comprehensive attention that she brought to bear on all human assemblies. The Ashworth family occupied the front pews, as was proper and expected. Patricia sat between Gregory and Sylvia, dressed impeccably in black, her face bearing an expression of dignified sorrow that suggested she had practiced it carefully before a mirror. Gregory appeared genuinely distressed, though Miss Marple noted that his distress seemed to concern itself primarily with the practical arrangements rather than the loss of his father, as evidenced by the fact that he kept turning to speak to the funeral director about various details even during the service itself. Sylvia maintained an expression of sympathetic concern, though her attention seemed to waver frequently toward the other mourners, as if she were mentally cataloguing who had chosen to attend and speculating about what their presence signified. Behind them sat various more distant relatives, aunts and cousy. N.S. from London and the surrounding counties, people who had perhaps not seen Edmund for years, but who felt that familial obligation, or the possibility of inheritance, required their presence at his funeral. Julian Hartley sat alone in a pew a few rows back, his face composed, but his eyes reddened in a way that suggested genuine grief, or, Miss Marple thought, very good acting. He had aged noticeably since Christmas Eve, lines appearing on his face that had not been so pronounced before, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of having been somewhat neglected. His daughter Catherine sat beside him, and it was Catherine who drew Miss Marple's particular attention. The younger woman showed no visible signs of emotion whatsoever. She did not weep, did not appear to struggle with tears, did not even lower her head in the sort of meditative posture that genuine mourning often produced. Instead, she gazed forward with an almost clinical interest, as if she were observing a theatrical performance rather than attending the funeral of a man who had been a significant figure in her father's life for decades. Dr. Raymond Price sat with his brother Michael, and it was Michael who drew Miss Marple's eye among this pair. The younger Price brother had the appearance of a man who had not slept well in several days. His eyes were shadowed, his complexion had taken on a greyish quality, and his hands, which rested on his lap throughout the service, trembled occasionally with a fine, persistent motion that suggested either cold or profound anxiety. Miss Marple had observed during the Christmas Eve gathering that Michael had possessed the sort of idle good looks that came easily to some men and seemed to require no particular exertion of character to maintain. Since Christmas Eve, something had changed in his appearance. It was as if some internal crisis had begun to manifest itself. Physically, aging him by several years in the course of just a few days. Margaret Thompson, the vicar's wife, sat with her husband in his accustomed place as the vicar's spouse, though her attention during the service seemed to focus less on the proceedings and more on the congregation itself. Miss Marple could see her eyes moving from person to person, assessing, calculating, no doubt already mentally composing the accounts she would deliver to various interested parties in the village once the service had concluded. The vicar himself, a sincere if somewhat unimaginative man named Thornton, conducted the service with appropriate gravity and the sort of vague platitudes about Edmund's character and contributions that seemed to assume that nobody present had actually known Edmund particularly well, or at least not in any way that required specific anecdotes or detailed recollection. What was remarkable, Miss Marple thought, as she listened to the service proceed toward its conclusion, was what was not being said. Nobody mentioned Edmund's relationship with his wife. Nobody referred to his somewhat distant relationship with his son, a distance that had apparently developed over the years and had been evident even during the Christmas Eve gathering to anyone paying attention. Nobody commented on his long association with Julian Hartley or wondered about the nature of that relationship, the extent to which it had been merely business or had perhaps encompassed something more complex. And nobody, most notably, suggested anything unusual about the circumstances of his death. No lingering questions, no sense that the official conclusion of heart failure might be incomplete or unsatisfactory. After the service concluded, the crowd dispersed according to the traditional patterns of funeral etiquette. Some people lingered to offer personal condolences to the family. Others moved toward their motor cars, eager to escape the cold and return to the more interesting business of discussing the funeral among themselves. A small group was invited back to Thornfield Manor for the wake, a gathering that Miss Marple understood would involve the consumption of substantial quantities of sherry and sandwiches, while various people said kind things about Edmund that would almost certainly have astonished him had he been present to hear them. Miss Marple, however, did not proceed to Thornfield Manor. Instead, she found herself walking slowly toward the village proper, accompanied by Margaret Thompson, who had also declined the invitation to the wake, with the excuse that her husband required her assistance with some parochial matter. The two women moved through the cold afternoon air with the practiced ease of people who had known each other for many years, and their conversation, to anyone observing them, would have seemed to consist of nothing more significant than observations about the weather and various village matters of minor importance. Yet beneath this surface conversation, Miss Marple was engaged in the process of gathering information. She asked Margaret, apparently casually, whether Edmund had seemed well in the weeks preceding his death. She wondered aloud whether the excitement of Christmas preparations might indeed have taxed his heart more significantly than anyone had anticipated. She speculated, in her gentle and seemingly artless way, about whether the family had experienced any particular stresses or difficulties in recent months, and Margaret, who considered herself a perceptive observer of village life and was always eager to demonstrate the breadth of her knowledge to someone who would listen with apparent genuine interest, provided answers that were considerably more revealing than she perhaps realized. Edmund, Margaret revealed, had seemed preoccupied in recent weeks. He had made several trips to London, in a manner that suggested urgency rather than pleasure. There had been some sort of disagreement between Edmund and Gregory regarding business matters, a disagreement significant enough that Patricia had commented upon it with concern. Julian Hartley had seemed distracted as well, and there had been some suggestion that the long partnership between Edmund and Julian might be approaching some kind of conclusion or transformation, though the precise nature of this potential change remained unclear. And Michael Price, curiously enough, had begun calling at Thornfield Manor with increasing frequency in recent weeks, always on some pretext or another, though what business the young man could possibly have with Edmund was a matter of considerable speculation in the village. As Miss Marple listened to Margaret's revelations, she found herself constructing a mental framework of the situation, a preliminary scaffolding upon which further evidence might be arranged. She did not yet know the truth of Edmund's death, but she was becoming increasingly convinced that the truth was considerably more complex and considerably more deliberate than a simple heart attack brought on by Christmas excitement. The question was not whether something suspicious had occurred, but rather what precisely that something had been, and which of the various people who had been present at Thornfield Manor on Christmas Eve bore responsibility for ensuring that Edmund Ashworth did not survive to see Christmas morning. The days following Edmund's funeral passed with a peculiar quality of time in winter, when daylight seemed to arrive late and depart early, leaving long stretches of grey afternoon that seemed to belong to neither day nor night, but to some indeterminate state existing between them. Miss Marple, returning to her cotter, in the village, found herself occupied with what others might have dismissed as idle speculation, but which she recognized as the serious work of investigation. She had lived long enough and observed human nature carefully enough to understand that the official conclusion regarding Edmund's death, while perhaps comforting to those who wished the matter settled, did not adequately account for the various peculiarities of behavior she had observed both during the Christmas Eve gathering and in its immediate aftermath. The question that occupied her mind was not whether Edmund had died of a heart attack, clearly he had, but rather whether that heart attack had been entirely natural or whether it had been in some fashion induced. On the morning of the 30th of December, Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage, a development that was unusual enough to merit her immediate and careful attention. The visitor was Dr. Raymond Price, the village physician, who arrived unannounced and somewhat agitated, his usual professional composure showing distinct signs of strain. He had come, he explained after settling himself in her sitting room with a cup of tea, because he had information that he felt obligated to share with someone, and he had decided, after considerable internal deliberation, that Miss Marple was the appropriate recipient of this information. What he proceeded to tell her was that he had performed a private examination of Edmund Ashworth's body prior to the formal autopsy conducted by Dr. Pritchard, the county examiner, and that he had discovered something that seemed to him significant enough to warrant further investigation, though he was uncertain how to proceed without drawing suspicion upon himself or creating unnecessary scandal. The significant discovery, according to Dr. Price, was a small puncture wound on Edmund's left arm, located in a position that would have been easily concealed by the sleeve of his nightshirt, and that would not have been evident to a casual observer. The wound appeared to have been made by a hypodermic needle, and the surrounding tissue showed signs of inflammation consistent with the injection of some substance that had caused irritation. When Dr. Pritchard had conducted his examination, he had apparently failed to notice this wound, or if he had noticed it, he had not considered it significant enough to mention in his report. Dr. Price had been reluctant to raise the matter officially, because he could not be entirely certain of his interpretation, and he had been concerned about creating unnecessary scandal around Edmund's death when a perfectly adequate explanation, that of a heart attack, was already available. Miss Marple had listened to this account with particular attention, asking several questions that revealed the depth of her understanding regarding medical matters. She wanted to know precisely where the puncture wound was located, whether Dr. Price had any theory regarding what substance might have been injected, and whether he was entirely certain that the wound had been made prior to death rather than being somehow incidental or unrelated to the fatal event. Dr. Price had been somewhat surprised by the specificity of her inquiries, and he had answered them as carefully as he was able. admitting that without a proper chemical analysis of the tissue surrounding the wound, he could not be certain what substance had been used, though certain compounds existed that could precipitate cardiac failure in individuals with pre-existing heart conditions, of which Edmund had indeed suffered from a mild form for several years. What emerged from this conversation was Miss Marple's gradually clarified understanding that Edmund's death had almost certainly not been natural, but had instead been deliberately engineered through the injection of some substance designed to trigger a fatal cardiac event. The question that remained was, who had perpetrated this crime, and for what motive? Miss Marple thanked Dr. Price for his courage in coming to her, assured him that she would treat his information with appropriate discretion, and requested that he maintain silence regarding his discovery until she had had opportunity to investigate further. Dr. Price, who seemed relieved to have shared his burden of knowledge with someone else, agreed to this arrangement, though he expressed considerable anxiety about the ethical implications of remaining silent while a potential murderer remained at large. After Dr. Price's departure, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room for a considerable period, her knitting abandoned beside her chair, her eyes focused on a point in the middle distance that seemed to represent neither the physical room around her nor anything external to it, but rather some internal landscape of thought and consideration. She had, through many years of observation, developed certain theories regarding the methods and motives of murder in small communities. Murder, she had found, was rarely committed on impulse or from passion, despite what the popular fiction of crime suggested. Instead, it was usually the product of careful planning, of motive accumulated over time, of opportunity seized and manipulated. The individual who killed Edmund Ashworth had done so with deliberation, had gained access to him at a moment when he was vulnerable, and had possessed both the knowledge and the courage to administer whatever substance had triggered the fatal cardiac event. This suggested someone with medical knowledge, or at least access to such knowledge. It suggested someone with sufficient motive to undertake such a drastic action, and it suggested someone with sufficient familiarity with Edmund to know that he would not resist an injection, or that he could be distracted or disabled in such a way as to allow the injection to be administered without significant struggle. Miss Marple began to construct a mental list of individuals who satisfied these preliminary criteria. Michael Price, certainly, as the younger brother of a physician, and someone who appeared to have both motive and opportunity. Dr. Price himself, though his coming to her with information seemed to contradict any theory of his involvement. Julian Hartley, with his long association with Edmund and his apparent financial entanglement with Edmund's affairs. Patricia Ashworth, with her surprising composure in the face of her husband's death and her oddly practical response to the crisis. Gregory Ashworth, with his financial concerns and his apparent anxiety in the days following the murder. Even Catherine Hartley, whose excessive calm and lack of apparent emotion suggested a personality capable of considerable detachment from ordinary human responses. Over the next several days, Miss Marple engaged in what might be described as careful reconnaissance. She visited various locations in the village, conducted conversations with various individuals, and observed patterns of behavior and association that might provide evidence regarding guilt or innocence. She learned from the pharmacist that Michael Price had purchased certain chemical compounds some 3 weeks prior to Christmas, compounds that were generally used in veterinary medicine, but that could, in appropriate doses, have been employed for the purpose of inducing cardiac distress. She discovered through conversation with Margaret Thompson that Gregory Ashworth was apparently in significant financial difficulty, his business ventures in London having encountered considerable problems, and that Edmund had a pair. Lee been considering withdrawing his financial support from his son's enterprises. She observed that Patricia Ashworth had begun making inquiries regarding the disposition of Edmund's estate and the timing of his will's reading with a degree of urgency that seemed to exceed what mere grief would suggest. Yet even as Miss Marple accumulated evidence and constructed various theories regarding the perpetration of Edmund's murder, she remained acutely aware that evidence and theory were not the same as proof, and that accusation without irrefutable demonstration of guilt would be not merely unjust but potentially dangerous. She needed not merely to understand who had killed Edmund Ashworth, but to understand how to reveal that truth in such a manner that the guilty party would have no choice but to acknowledge their culpability. This required patience, careful observation, and the sort of psychological insight into human nature that was Miss Marple's particular gift. It required her to understand not merely what had occurred, but why it had occurred, what desperation or resentment or fear had driven someone to contemplate and then execute the murder of a man with whom they had maintained relationships of apparent normalcy. The turning point in Miss Marple's investigation came not through any dramatic revelation, but through the small, seemingly insignificant detail that had caught her attention during the Christmas Eve gathering, and that she had filed away in her memory alongside countless other observations accumulated over many decades of careful attention to human behavior. She had noticed, during the evening before Edmund's death, that Michael Price had excused himself from the drawing room at approximately 10 o'clock, claiming the need to use the facilities. He had been absent for a period of some 12 to 15 minutes, a duration considerably longer than such an errand would ordinarily require. Upon his return, his manner had seemed slightly agitated, and he had positioned himself in such a way as to avoid direct conversation with most of the other guests for several minutes afterward. Miss Marple had filed this observation away without immediately assigning it significance, but now, with the knowledge that Edmund's death had been deliberately engineered through the injection of some substance, that absence acquired considerable new meaning. The question that occupied Miss Marple's attention was whether Michael Price had used those 12 to 15 minutes to gain access to Edmund's bedroom, or whether his absence had been devoted to some other purpose entirely. To answer this question required her to understand the geography of Thornfield Manor in greater detail than she currently possessed, and it required her to gain access to information that was not readily available through casual village gossip. This necessitated a more direct approach than Miss Marple ordinarily preferred, but she had learned that circumstances sometimes demanded boldness rather than her customary patient observation. On the 2nd of January, Miss Marple contrived an invitation to tea at Thornfield Manor, where Patricia Ashworth was beginning the process of organizing her household, following the immediate shock of Edmund's death. The visit was arranged through the gentle manipulation of circumstances that Miss Marple had perfected over many years, a combination of expressed interest in Patricia's well-being and veiled suggestion that her company might be appreciated by a widow in the early stages of grief. Patricia, who had always treated Miss Marple with the sort of polite deference that the elderly sometimes receive from those younger and more prominent in village society, accepted the invitation with apparent pleasure, though Miss Marple noted Death at Patricia's pleasure seemed somewhat forced, as if she were engaging in the performance of social ritual rather than experiencing genuine enthusiasm. During the course of this tea, Miss Marple engaged Patricia in conversation regarding the arrangements for the house, the disposition of various rooms, and the general organization of the estate. She asked seemingly innocent questions about which rooms had been occupied by which guests during the Christmas Eve gathering, expressed concern about whether the house had adequate facilities for entertaining, and wondered aloud about the efficiency of the various corridors and passages that connected different sections of the manor. Through these apparently casual inquiries, she gained a precise mental map of the house's layout and, more importantly, confirmation regarding the location of Edmund's bedroom in relation to the drawing room, the bathrooms, and the secondary staircase that connected the upper floor to the kitchen areas below. What emerged from this visit was the recognition that access to Edmund's bedroom from the drawing room would have required passage through either the main hallway or the secondary staircase, both of which would have been observable to anyone present in certain parts of the house. However, there was a third possibility, a series of connecting passages that had been constructed during various renovations of the manor over the centuries, and that Patricia, during the course of their conversation, had mentioned somewhat casually as an example of the house's architectural peculiarities. These passages, which had originally served to allow servants to move through the house without being observed by the family and guests, provided a route from the drawing-room area to the upper floor that would be largely invisible to anyone not specifically aware of their existence. Miss Marple filed this in format, ion away with considerable satisfaction, as it provided exactly the sort of opportunity that would have been necessary for Michael Price to access Edmund's bedroom without being observed. The next phase of Miss Marple's investigation required her to determine not merely that opportunity had existed, but that Michael Price had possessed both motive and the means to perpetrate the murder. The means, as Dr. Price had suggested, appeared to be satisfied through Michael S.'s apparent purchase of certain chemical compounds in the weeks preceding Christmas. The motive was considerably less clear, though Miss Marple's conversations with various village residents had suggested that Michael Price was experiencing financial difficulties of a nature more severe than his apparent income would ordinarily suggest. Margaret Thompson had mentioned, in one of their numerous conversations, that Michael had been observed in company with certain individuals known to be involved in various schemes of questionable legality. There had been suggestions of gambling debts, of business ventures that had failed to produce the promised returns, and of creditors who were becoming increasingly impatient regarding payment. What tied Michael Price to Edmund Ashworth, however, was a detail that Miss Marple had initially overlooked, but which acquired significance when she considered the broader context of relationships within the village. Michael's brother, Dr. Raymond Price, had apparently treated Edmund Ashworth for various minor ailments over the years, and during the course of one such treatment, Edmund had mentioned to the doctor his concerns regarding his son Gregory's financial situation and his own reluctance to continue providing financial support for ventures that seemed to be failing. This conversation, reported to Miss Marple by Margaret Thompson with all the breathless enthusiasm of someone in power. Ting's scandalous intelligence had apparently reached Michael's ears through his brother's somewhat careless repetition of confidences, shared in professional contexts. The significance of this information was that Michael Price had apparently believed, whether correctly or incorrectly, that Edmund Ashworth was the source of certain financial opportunities that might have ameliorated his own circumstances. Whether this belief had been based on actual conversations between Edmund and Michael, or whether it had been merely the product of Michael's desperate imagination, Miss Marple could not yet determine. What seemed clear, however, was that Michael had positioned himself in proximity to Edmund during the Christmas Eve gathering with apparent purpose, had managed to gain access to Edmund's bedroom through means that exploited the manor's architectural peculiarities, and had administered some substance designed to trigger the cardiac failure that had claimed Edmund's life. Yet even as Miss Marple constructed this narrative, she recognized that it remained circumstantial and incomplete. She possessed no direct evidence of Michael's guilt. She had no witnesses who could attest to his presence in Edmund's bedroom. She had no chemical analysis of the substance that had been injected or confirmation that the compounds Michael had purchased were indeed the instrument of Edmund's death. Without such evidence, any accusation would be merely speculation, however well-founded that speculation might be. Miss Marple recognized that she needed to conduct a final test, a psychological maneuver that would either confirm her theory or force her to abandon it in favor of alternative explanations. She needed, in short, to confront Michael Price with the truth of what she believed had occurred, and to observe his reaction with the sort of careful attention that had guided her investigations. Throughout her long life, the confrontation, when it came, took place not in any dramatic or public setting but in the comparative privacy of the village tea-room on a quiet afternoon in early January, a location that Miss Marple had deliberately chosen because it was sufficiently public to ensure safety but sufficiently private to allow for candid conversation. She had invited Michael Price to join her for tea through the simple expedient of encountering him on the village high street and expressing concern regarding his apparent ill health and distress since Christmas. Michael, who had apparently developed a habit of avoiding most social contact in the weeks following Edmund's death, had been surprised by her solicitude, but had accepted the invitation with the weariness of someone too exhausted to devise a polite refusal. Over tea and small cakes, Miss Marple engaged Michael in conversation that appeared to any observer to be nothing more than the pleasant, rambling discourse of an elderly woman with an elderly gentleman discussing matters of minor village importance. She asked about his brother's medical practice, expressed concern regarding his own health and the general state of village life, and made various observations about the changing seasons and the particular difficulties that winter presented for those living in rural areas. All of this was conducted with the sort of gentle, seemingly artless manner that had characterized Miss Marple's social interactions for decades. Yet beneath this surface conversation, she was engaged in a considerably more delicate process of psychological exploration, carefully introducing topics that she believed would provoke reactions revealing the truth of his involvement in Edmund's death. It was during the course of discussing the difficulties that young people faced in establishing themselves financially that Miss Marple reduced the subject of Edmund's financial affairs and his apparent reluctance to continue supporting his son Gregory's business ventures. She spoke of this with sympathy, noting that Edmund had seemed genuinely concerned about the state of Gregory's finances in the weeks preceding his death, that he had apparently been consulting with various advisors regarding the best method to address the situation without merely enabling further poor decisions on Gregory's part. She observed with apparent casualness that it must be difficult for younger men in the village to establish themselves when financial support from established figures was becoming increasingly scarce. It was at this point that she noticed, with the careful attention that was her particular gift, the first significant change in Michael's demeanor. His hand trembled slightly as he raised his teacup. His jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek contracted almost imperceptibly. These were small physical responses, the sort of thing that most people would fail to observe or, observing, would dismiss as insignificant. But Miss Marple had learned that human bodies often revealed truths that the conscious mind attempted to conceal, and these small manifestations of distress suggested that she had touched upon something of considerable significance to Michael Price. She continued with deliberate gentleness, noting that Edmund had been a generous man in his way, though perhaps not always as generous as some people might have hoped. She remarked that it was curious how one's perception of generosity often depended upon one's own circumstances and needs, that what seemed like adequate provision to one person might seem like cruel withholding to another, particularly if one had been led to believe that certain financial benefits might be forthcoming. She wondered aloud whether Edmund had ever discussed with Michael any possibility of financial assistance or business opportunity, noting that Edmund had seemed somewhat preoccupied in recent weeks with matters that suggested considerable financial complexity. Michael's response to this observation was precisely what Miss Marple had anticipated. He became defensive, his voice taking on a sharp quality that had not been evident in earlier portions of their conversation. He suggested, with rather more emotion than the topic seemed to warrant, that Edmund's financial affairs were no concern of his, that he had never expected anything from Edmund Ashworth, and that it was impertinent to suggest otherwise. He rose from the table somewhat abruptly, claiming urgent business elsewhere, and attempted to excuse himself from the tea-room. Miss Marple, however, reached out and gently touched his arm, her gesture conveying both physical restraint and psychological appeal. She suggested, with the sort of compassionate authority that came from many decades of dealing with troubled individuals, that it might be beneficial for Michael to sit down once more and perhaps share whatever burden he had been carrying since Christmas Eve. The psychological impact of this simple gesture and these quietly spoken words was considerably greater than Miss Marple's physical strength could have imposed. Michael, who appeared to have been balanced precariously on the edge of psychological collapse for several days, seemed to crumble under the weight of this unexpected compassion. He sank back into his chair, his face acquiring a grayish quality, and he began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. What emerged from his halting, broken narrative was a confession of desperation, of financial ruin brought about through a series of increasingly questionable business ventures and gambling debts that had accumulated to a point where legitimate solutions seemed impossible. Michael had apparently approached Edmund Ashworth several weeks prior to Christmas, requesting financial assistance of a substantial nature to address these debts. Edmund had apparently responded with sympathy, but had ultimately refused, suggesting that Michael needed to learn the consequences of his poor financial decisions rather than having those consequences cushioned by the intervention of others. This refusal, which seemed to most people like the reasonable response of a prudent man, unwilling to enable poor decision-making, had been experienced by Michael as a form of betrayal and abandonment. Michael had apparently become convinced that Edmund's refusal was motivated not by principle, but by unwillingness to assist him specifically, and he had brooded upon this perceived injustice with increasing intensity as Christmas approached. The actual perpetration of the murder, as Michael now recounted it in his broken confession, had been neither carefully planned nor the product of overwhelming passion, but rather the result of a kind of desperate impulsivity combined with opportunity. When Michael had discovered the servants' passages during a tour of Thornfield Manor, he had seen in them the possibility of accessing Edmund's bedroom unseen. When he had learned from his brother of the specific chemical compounds that could precipitate cardiac failure in individuals with Edmund's particular heart condition, he had purchased these compounds almost as if he were enacting a fantasy rather than planning an actual crime. When Christmas Eve had arrived and he had found himself in the house with Edmund apparently vulnerable and alone, he had acted upon impulses that he had not fully acknowledged to himself until the moment of their execution. The injection had been administered with remarkable ease, Edmund offering no resistance because Michael had approached him with apparent casualness, suggesting merely that he had obtained certain medical information that Edmund might find valuable regarding his heart condition. Edmund, unsuspecting and perhaps even grateful for this display of concern, had allowed Michael to approach him, and the injection had been accomplished before Edmund had fully realized what was occurring. Death had followed within minutes, the chemical compound triggering the cardiac failure that had provided the perfect cover for Michael's crime. Michael had then retreated through the servants' passages, returned to the drawing room as if he had merely been using the facilities, and had spent the remainder of the evening attempting to maintain the facade of normality while internally collapsing under the weight of what he had accomplished. The confession that emerged from Michael Price in the quiet privacy of the tea-room was, Miss Marple recognized, only the beginning of a considerably more complex narrative that would require careful unraveling and verification before it could be presented as conclusive evidence to the authorities. Michael's account of his actions, while emotionally compelling and psychologically coherent, lacked the kind of specific detail that would satisfy the legal requirements of proof. Moreover, Miss Marple was acutely aware that a confession obtained in the circumstances in which Michael had provided it, emotional distress, psychological vulnerability, and the apparent sympathy of an elderly woman in a public location, might be susceptible to challenge on the grounds that it had been coerced or obtained under duress, however gently that duress might have been applied. She therefore found herself in the peculiar position of possessing knowledge of guilt, but lacking the evidence necessary to ensure that this guilt could be properly established within the framework of law. What Miss Marple did, with characteristic wisdom, born of long experience with the complexities of human justice, was to guide Michael toward the appropriate course of action while maintaining the appearance of merely offering advice to a troubled individual. She suggested with the sort of gentle insistence that had proven effective in her previous dealings with troubled people, that Michael should make a proper confession to the authorities, that attempting to conceal his guilt would only prolong his suffering, and that the possibility of redemption through acknowledgement of wrongdoing was considerably preferable to the alternative of living with the knowledge of his crime hidden within his heart. She pointed out, with the sort of logical clarity that could not be easily disputed, that the physical evidence which Dr. Price had observed, the puncture wound on Edmund's body, would eventually lead investigators to examine more closely the circumstances of Edmund's death, and that Michael's earlier evasion would only make his eventual culpability appear more damning. After Michael had departed from the tea-room, Miss Marple sat for a considerable period, her untouched teacup cooling before her, her thoughts occupied with the various threads of the case and the manner in which they had woven together to produce the pattern that had revealed Michael's guilt. She reflected on the nature of desperation and how it could transform ordinary people into those capable of extraordinary violence. She contemplated the question of whether Edmund Ashworth had deserved the fate that had befallen him, whether his refusal to assist Michael had been the product of principle or of a kind of casual cruelty that came from never having experienced genuine financial need. She considered the broader question of justice and whether the legal system, with all its apparatus of courts and evidence and formal procedures, actually succeeded in addressing the moral dimensions of crime. or whether it merely processed human tragedy through bureaucratic mechanisms that reduced complex human suffering to a series of documented facts. What occurred over the following days was a process considerably less dramatic than popular fiction might suggest. Michael Price did not immediately rush to the authorities with a confession. Instead, he returned to his lodgings and spent several days in a state of profound internal conflict, his mind apparently oscillating between the desire for confession and the impulse toward continued concealment. It was only when Constable Henwick, following up on inquiries that had been initiated by Dr. Price regarding the puncture wound on Edmund body, began to ask more probing questions about Michael's movements on Christmas Eve that Michael finally came forward with his confession. This confession was delivered not to Miss Marple but to Constable Henwick in the formal setting of the police station, with Michael's brother present in the capacity of moral support, and it was documented with all the official procedures and legal formalities that such a serious matter required. The confession, when properly recorded and examined, revealed considerably more complexity than Michael's initial halting account to Miss Marple had suggested. Under the careful questioning of Constable Henwick, Michael had been forced to specify precisely how he had accessed Edmund's bedroom, what chemical compound he had employed for the injection, where he had obtained this compound, and what had motivated him to undertake such a drastic action. The evidence that emerged from this formal questioning process provided the necessary substantiation for what Miss Marple had already intuited, that Edmund's death had been murder rather than natural causes, that Michael Price was responsible for this murder, and that the motive had been financial desperation combined with resentment at Edmund's refusal to provide assistance. Yet even as Michael's guilt was being formally established through the processes of law, Miss Marple found herself occupied with questions that extended beyond the simple matter of identifying the murderer. She had come to understand, through her investigation of the case, that Michael's desperation had been genuine and that his crimes, while inexcusable, had been born of circumstances that might have been prevented through different choices on the parts of various individuals. She wondered what might have occurred had Edmund responded to Michael's request for financial assistance with greater compassion, had he taken time to understand the genuine depth of Michael's difficulties, rather than dismissing them as the mere consequences of poor decision-making. She considered whether the village itself, with its complex web of social relationships and its informal systems of mutual assistance, might have addressed Michael's situation more effectively had anyone recognized the severity of his distress. She was also increasingly aware that the revelation of Michael's guilt, while solving the immediate mystery of Edmund's death, raised new and considerably more troubling questions regarding the responsibilities of those who possessed knowledge of potential crimes. Dr. Price, the village physician and Michael's brother, had become aware through Michael's confession of the truth regarding Edmund's death, yet he had been placed in the extraordinarily difficult position of having his professional judgment regarding the puncture wound vindicated, while simultaneously being forced to confront the fact that his brother had perpetrated a murder. The ethical and moral complexities of this situation, the tension between family loyalty and social responsibility, the weight of knowledge that could not be shared without causing additional suffering, occupied Miss Marple's thoughts as she reflected on the concluding phases of the case. The legal proceedings that followed were relatively swift by the standards of criminal justice. Michael Price was formally charged with the murder of Edmund Ashworth. Evidence was gathered regarding his purchase of the chemical compound, his presence at Thornfield Manor on the evening of Christmas Eve, and his movements through the house as attested to by various witnesses. His confession, while initially concerning to some as potentially coerced, was corroborated by the physical evidence of the puncture wound, and by the chemical analysis of Edmund's remains, which confirmed the presence of the specific compound that Michael had employed. The case proceeded through the formal machinery of the legal system, with the sort of inexorable efficiency that such matters typically displayed once the evidence became sufficiently conclusive. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully as she observed these proceedings unfold was not the efficiency of the legal process, but rather its inadequacy in addressing the deeper human dimensions of the tragedy that had unfolded. The law could establish guilt and determine punishment, could move through its formal procedures with appropriate precision, but it could not address the question of how a young man had come to be so desperate that murder seemed a reasonable response to rejection. It could not examine the question of Edmund's responsibilities toward those who had appealed to him for assistance. It could not address the broader societal failures that had allowed Michael's financial situation to deteriorate to the point where he had felt compelled to undertake such drastic action. These were questions that lay beyond the purview of law, and yet they seemed to Miss Marple to be the questions that truly mattered in understanding not merely what had occurred, but why it had been allowed to occur. The psychological examination that Miss Marple conducted of Michael Price during their final encounter before his formal prosecution was, in many respects, the most significant test of her investigative methodology, for it required her to move beyond the mere accumulation of facts and evidence and to penetrate to the deeper levels of human motivation and psychological state that had ultimately driven Michael toward the perpetration of murder. She had requested, through intermediaries and with the cooperation of Constable Henwick, a final private conversation with Michael before he was remanded to custody to await trial. This request had been granted somewhat reluctantly, as such conversations were not standard procedure. But Miss Marple's reputation in the village and her demonstrated concern for the welfare of those involved in the case had apparently persuaded the authorities that her meeting with Michael might serve some therapeutic or clarifying purpose. The conversation took place in a small room at the police station, a cold and institutional space that seemed designed specifically to discourage any form of human connection or warmth. Michael, who had apparently aged considerably in the days since his confession, appeared diminished and hollowed out, as if the act of confession had drained from him the last reserves of energy and will that had sustained him through the period of concealment. He seemed almost relieved to see Miss Marple, as if her presence represented a connection to the normal world outside the machinery of criminal justice that had now ensnared him. Miss Marple approached this final conversation with considerable delicacy, recognizing that Michael was in a state of profound psychological vulnerability and that her words might either contribute to his redemption or accelerate his descent into despair. She began by acknowledging the genuine distress that Michael had experienced, the legitimacy of his financial fears, and the understandable desperation that had motivated his actions. She did not excuse his crime or suggest that murder was ever an appropriate response to rejection or hardship, but neither did she adopt the stance of moral condemnation that might have been expected from someone of her age and social position. Instead, she engaged with Michael as a human being capable of understanding, if not of forgiving, the complexities of his situation. What emerged from this conversation was Miss Marple's recognition that Michael had committed his crime not from any inherent evil or profound moral corruption, but rather from a kind of catastrophic failure of imagination regarding alternative courses of action. In the moment, when Edmund had refused his request for financial assistance, Michael had apparently experienced this refusal not as a reasonable decision based on prudent principles, but as a personal rejection, as evidence that he was unworthy of assistance, that his suffering was insufficiently compelling to merit intervention from those better positioned to provide it. This psychological interpretation of events had then been reinforced through a period of brooding rumination, during which Michael had constructed increasingly elaborate justifications for violence, had convinced himself that Edmund's death would somehow resolve his financial difficulties, had allowed desperation to override moral restraint. Miss Marple attempted to help Michael understand that this progression from desperation to violence, to this moment of reckoning, had not been inevitable, that other choices had existed at various junctures, and that understanding this fact, while painful, might offer some possibility of redemption, or at least of meaningful repentance. She suggested that the period of incarceration that would almost certainly follow his trial need not be merely a punishment, but could instead become an opportunity for genuine reflection on the nature of his choices and their consequences. She spoke of the possibility that even within the constraints of imprisonment, Michael might discover resources of character and human connection that could give his suffering meaning beyond mere retribution. Michael's response to these suggestions was one of profound emotional release. He wept, genuinely and without restraint, his entire body seeming to convulse with the accumulated grief and guilt that had been building within him since the moment he had administered the injection to Edmund's arm. Miss Marple allowed this emotional display to continue without interruption, recognizing that such release was necessary and potentially therapeutic. She sat quietly, her small figure upright in the institutional chair, and she simply bore witness to Michael's suffering in the way that she had learned, over many decades, was often the most meaningful form of human assistance that one person could offer to another in the grip of genuine despair. When Michael's tears had finally subsided and he had regained some measure of composure, Miss Marple addressed the final matter that occupied her attention regarding this case. She asked Michael whether he could recall, with any precision, the exact moment at which he had decided to perpetrate the murder, whether there had been a specific instant at which his intentions had crystallized from fantasy into deliberate action. Michael's response was revelatory in its honesty. He described the moment of finding the servant's passage, the moment of learning from his brother about the chemical compound, the moment of accessing Edmund's bedroom, and finally the moment of approaching Edmund with the hypodermic concealed in his sleeve. But he could not identify any single moment at which he had consciously decided to commit murder. Instead, he described a kind of psychological momentum in which each decision had seemed to lead inevitably to the next, each small choice seemingly insignificant in isolation, but accumulating into a trajectory that had ended in Edmund's death. This account, Miss Marple recognized, revealed something profoundly important about the psychology of crime in circumstance. NCEs such as these. Michael had not awakened on Christmas Eve morning with the firm intention of murdering Edmund Ashworth. Instead, his crime had been the product of accumulated psychological pressure, of desperation that had gradually eroded the normal restraints that prevented ordinary people from committing extraordinary violence, of a series of small choices that had each seemed reasonable or at least understandable in the moment, but which had collectively led to a point of no return. This understanding did not excuse Michael's actions, but it provided a framework within which his behavior could be understood as something other than the product of fundamental evil or psychological abnormality. Miss Marple left the police station after this conversation with the sense of having completed her investigation in a manner that satisfied her own internal standards of thoroughness and understanding, even if it left unresolved many of the broader questions regarding justice, responsibility, and the prevention of such tragedies in the future. She had identified the murderer, had understood his motivations, had witnessed his acknowledgement of guilt, and had engaged in a final conversation that she believed had provided Michael with some measure of psychological illumination regarding the nature of his choices and their consequences. Beyond this, there lay only the formal machinery of law, the trial, the conviction, the sentence, and the long years of imprisonment that would follow. These were matters that lay beyond her purview, and yet she could not entirely shake the sense that the legal system, while necessary and in many ways admirable in its commitment to process and evidence, remained fundamentally limited in its ability to address the deeper human dimensions of crime and punishment that truly mattered. The trial of Michael Price took place in late February, some 2 months after the death of Edmund Ashworth on Christmas Eve. The proceedings unfolded in the county courthouse with the sort of formal solemnity that criminal justice required, the courtroom filled with interested observers from the village and surrounding areas, all eager to witness the culmination of what had been the most significant event to occur in Thornfield in living memory. Miss Marple attended the trial, as she felt obligated to do, sitting quietly in the public gallery and observing not merely the legal proceedings, but the emotional and psychological dimensions of the drama that was being enacted before the assembled crowd. The prosecution's case was straightforward and compelling. Evidence was presented regarding Michael's financial desperation, his approach to Edmund requesting assistance, Edmund's refusal, and Michael's subsequent purchase of the chemical compound that had been employed in the murder. The puncture wound on Edmund's body was documented through medical testimony, and the chemical analysis of Edmund's remains confirmed the presence of the specific substance that had precipitated his death. Michael's confession was entered into evidence, and while his defense attempted to argue that this confession had been obtained under duress or in circumstances that rendered it inadmissible, the court ultimately ruled that the confession was both valid and admissible. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully during the trial was the manner in which the legal system, in its pursuit of establishing guilt through presentation of evidence and testimony, seemed to strip away the human complexity that had characterized her own investigation of the case. The law required that guilt be proven beyond reasonable doubt through presentation of factual evidence, and in this context, Michael's motivations, his psychological state, his genuine remorse, and the broader societal failures that had contributed to his desperation seemed almost irrelevant to the central question of whether he had committed the act with which he was charged. The defense, while technically competent, seemed almost perfunctory in its execution. Michael's attorney presented arguments regarding the defendant's previously unblemished character, his genuine psychological distress, and the extenuating circumstances that had motivated his actions. But these arguments seemed to have little impact upon the judge, or upon the jury that had been assembled to determine his guilt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty, and the judge, in pronouncing sentence, expressed profound disapproval of the crime, while nevertheless imposing a sentence of life imprisonment rather than seeking capital punishment, a merciful decision that Miss Marple suspected reflected some degree of judicial recognition that Michael's circumstances, while not excusing his crime, at least rendered it comprehensible as something other than the act of a fundamentally evil person. What occupied Miss Marple's thoughts as she observed Michael being led away from the courtroom was not satisfaction at the successful conclusion of her investigation or pleasure at having identified the guilty party, but rather a complex mixture of emotions that included sadness, resignation, and a kind of weary acknowledgement of the limitations of human justice. She had come to understand that while the law could establish guilt and determine punishment, it could not actually heal the damage that had been done, could not resurrect Edmund Ashworth from the dead, could not restore Michael Price to the state of innocent youth from which he had fallen into desperation and violence. The legal system would now proceed to incarcerate Michael for many years, perhaps for the remainder of his life, and yet Miss Marple could not entirely convince herself that this outcome represented genuine justice in any meaningful sense. She found herself reflecting on the question of Edmund's own culpability, on the extent to which his refusal to assist Michael had contributed to the tragedy that had unfolded. Edmund had been, by all accounts, a prudent and successful man who had built his life and his wealth through careful decisions and the avoidance of financial excess. His refusal to assist Michael had been motivated by perfectly reasonable principles regarding the importance of individuals taking responsibility for their own choices and their consequences. Yet Miss Marple could not help but wonder whether Edmund's commitment to these principles had been born of genuine moral conviction, or whether it had instead been the product of comfortable distance from genuine hardship, the privilege of a man who had never experienced the kind of desperation that might drive someone to contemplate violence. The immediate aftermath of the trial saw Thornfield gradually returning to its normal rhythms, though with an undercurrent of unease that suggested the village's sense of safety had been permanently altered by the knowledge that murder could occur even in its peaceful setting. Patricia Ashworth had been left a widow, though she appeared to be bearing this circumstance with remarkable equanimity, and she had begun the process of disposing of Edmund's estate and reorganizing her life according to her own preferences. Gregory and his wife Sylvia had remained in the village for some weeks following the trial before returning to London, and Miss Marple had observed that their departure seemed to be greeted with a kind of collective relief by the village population, as if the presence of Edmund's son had reminded people too forcefully of the tragedy that had occurred. Julian Hartley and his daughter Catherine had also begun to withdraw somewhat from village social life, and Miss Marple suspected that Edmund's death and its aftermath had disturbed the equilibrium that had previously existed in their relationships with the Ashworth family. The comfortable patterns of social interaction that had characterized the village before Christmas had been disrupted, and while new patterns would eventually emerge, There remained a period of adjustment and recalibration during which the community seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, uncertain of the proper way to proceed, given that the fundamental assumptions regarding safety and predictability had been violated. In the weeks following Michael Price's conviction and sentencing, Miss Marple found herself occupied with reflections that extended considerably beyond the immediate facts of the case and into broader considerations regarding the nature of justice, responsibility, and the role that individuals such as herself played in the processes through which communities addressed crime and punishment. She had received several inquiries from both Constable Henwick and various officials connected with the legal system, all seeking her insights into how she had managed to identify Michael as the perpetrator when the initial investigation had concluded that Edmund's death was from natural causes. These inquiries had been conducted with appropriate deference to her age and her reputation in the village, but Miss Marple recognized that beneath the courtesy lay a genuine desire to understand her methodology, as if the officials believed that some systematic approach existed that could be replicated or taught to others. Miss Marple had attempted to explain, in her characteristically modest fashion, that her investigation had relied upon nothing more systematic or extraordinary than careful observatio of human behavior, combined with an understanding of human nature that came from many decades of living in close proximity to diverse individuals and communities. She had suggested that most crime, particularly in small communities, was motivated by comprehensible human emotions and desires, and that understanding these emotions and desires was often more valuable than examining physical evidence. She had emphasized that the smallest details of behavior, the hesitation in speech, the trembling of a hand, the quality of silence that followed certain remarks, often revealed truths that more obvious evidence might conceal. She had, in essence, attempted to articulate an approach to investigation that was fundamentally psychological and observational rather than forensic or technical. What Miss Marple did not fully articulate, even to herself, was the extent to which her investigation had been driven not merely by curiosity regarding the identity of the murderer, but by deeper concerns regarding the nature of justice in the circumstances of Edmund's death. She had come to recognize, through her conversations with Michael and through her observations of the various individuals involved in the case, that Edmund's death was not merely a crime, but was instead a tragedy in the classical sense, an event in which the actions of various individuals had collectively produced an outcome that none of them would have chosen had they fully understood the consequences of their choices. Edmund, through his commitment to prudent principles regarding financial responsibility, had refused to assist Michael apparently, unaware of the depth of Michael's desperation. Michael, through his desperation and his brooding resentment, had allowed his intention to commit murder to crystallize from fantasy into deliberate action. Patricia, through her apparent detachment and her rapid adaptation to Dowhood, had suggested a marriage that was perhaps more complicated than it had appeared on the surface. Dr. Price, through his professional discretion regarding confidential medical information, had inadvertently enabled Michael's knowledge of the chemical compounds that would eventually be employed in the murder. None of these individuals had consciously intended to contribute to Edmund's death, and yet each of their actions or inactions had played some role in the chain of events that had led to that outcome. Miss Marple had begun to understand that the identification of Michael as the murderer, while legally satisfying and practically necessary, represented only a partial resolution of the deeper moral and psychological dimensions of the case. The legal system could establish guilt and determine punishment, but it could not address the question of collective responsibility, the extent to which the community itself bore some degree of culpability for having failed to recognize or address Michael's desperation before it had reached the point of violence. It could not examine Edmund's responsibilities toward those who appealed to him for assistance. It could not address the structural inequalities that had made Michael's financial desperation seem so catastrophic that murder appeared to be a reasonable response to rejection. In this recognition lay both the limitation and, paradoxically, the value of Miss Marple's particular approach to investigation. She had not been satisfied with merely identifying the perpetrator of the crime, but had instead insisted upon understanding the complex of motivations and circumstances that had produced the crime. This understanding did not excuse Michael's actions or diminish his guilt, but it provided a framework within which his crime could be comprehended as something other than the inexplicable act of a fundamentally evil person. It suggested that crime prevention, in communities such as Thornfield, might involve not merely the identification and punishment of criminals, but rather the development of social structures and practices that would address desperation and resentment before they reached the point of violent expression. Yet Miss Marple was also acutely aware that such insights, however valuable they might be in terms of understanding human nature and social dynamics, could not be easily translated into practical action through the existing structures of society. The legal system would continue to operate according to its established procedures, identifying guilt and determining punishment without particular regard for the broader social and psychological contexts within which crimes occurred. Individuals like herself would continue to engage in investigations and reflections that extended beyond what the law required, but these investigations would remain essentially private, matters of personal understanding rather than public knowledge or institutional practice. As winter gradually gave way to spring in Thornfield, Miss Marple found herself gradually withdrawing from the intense focus that the case had demanded, allowing her attention to return to the ordinary concerns of village life and her own personal relationships and interests. The immediate crisis had passed. Justice had been achieved in the formal sense, and the community was beginning the process of returning to its normal patterns and rhythms. Yet something had changed in Miss Marple's understanding of the village and its inhabitants. She had come to recognize that beneath the surface of apparent normalcy and contentment lay complexities and tensions that could, under certain circumstances, erupt into violence and tragedy. She had come to understand that her role in the community was not merely to observe and report, but to bear witness to the full complexity of human experience, including its capacity for both generosity and cruelty, for both virtue and vice. The spring of that year brought to Thornfield the sort of gentle renewal that the English countryside typically experienced during the transition from winter to warmer months. The hedgerows beginning to burst with new growth, the gardens of various households exhibiting signs of careful preparation and cultivation. Miss Marple, observing these external signs of seasonal change, found herself occupied with internal reflections regarding the manner in which the village itself seemed to be engaged in a process of psychological renewal and adjustment, following the trauma of Edmund's murder and Michael's prosecution. The initial shock and scandal that had gripped the community in the aftermath of the trial had gradually subsided, replaced by a kind of cautious normalcy that suggested people were attempting to move forward, while nevertheless maintaining awareness that the fundamental assumptions of safety and predictability upon which village life depended had been permanently altered. What had emerged most clearly in the months following the trial was the recognition that Edmund Ashworth's death, while shocking in its manner, had not disrupted the basic functioning of the community or caused irreparable damage to the social structures through which Thornfield operated. Patricia Ashworth had proven herself to be a capable administrator of her late husband's estate, demonstrating competence in financial matters that suggested Edmund's control of household finances had perhaps obscured his wife's own abilities and intelligence. She had begun to participate more actively in village affairs, had taken on various charitable responsibilities that had previously been Edmund's domain, and had gradually established herself as a figure of respect and authority in her own right, rather than merely as the wife of a prominent man. This transformation suggested to Miss Marple that Edmund's death, while tragic, had not been entirely without consequence for his widow, and that Patricia's apparent acceptance of her new circumstances might reflect genuine relief at being freed from constraints that had perhaps limited her own development and autonomy. Gregory and Sylvia had settled more permanently into their London residence, though they maintained appropriate connections with Thornfield and with Patricia. Their visits to the village had become less frequent, and Miss Marple observed that when they did visit, there seemed to be a quality of awkwardness in their interactions, as if Edmund's death and Michael's crime had created distance between Gregory and his mother that had not previously existed. Miss Marple suspected that Gregory's financial difficulties, which had apparently been significant enough to require Edmund's continued support, had not been resolved by his father's death, and that Gregory's relationship with his mother was now complicated by questions regarding the disposition of Edmund's estate and the degree to which Patricia would be willing to provide the financial assistance that Edmund had apparently been gradually withdrawing. Julian Hartley and his daughter Catherine had gradually re-established their previous patterns of social interaction, though Miss Marple noted that the quality of their relationship seemed to have subtly altered in the months following the murder. Catherine had continued her intensive gardening activities at her cottage, and she had begun to display increasing interest in horticultural matters that suggested this interest transcended mere hobby or aesthetic concern. She had begun to correspond with various botanical societies and had apparently undertaken a systematic study of plant cultivation that indicated the possibility of genuine intellectual engagement with the subject matter. Miss Marple, observing these developments, found herself reconsidering her earlier impressions of Catherine, recognizing that what she had initially interpreted as suspicious detachment might instead have been merely the natural reserve of an individual whose interests and passions lay outside the conventional channels through which village social life was typically organized. The Price brothers had also continued to navigate their own complex relationship in the aftermath of Michael's conviction and imprisonment. Dr. Price had maintained his medical practice and his position in village life, though Miss Marple observed that he seemed to carry a burden of guilt regarding his role in his brother's crime, however indirect that role might have been. He appeared to have accepted some degree of responsibility for not having recognized the depth of Michael's desperation, and he had apparently begun to engage in charitable activities that suggested an attempt to address the structural inequalities that had contributed to Michael's circumstances. Miss Marple had observed him volunteering with various organizations designed to assist individuals experiencing financial difficulties, and she had noted that these activities seemed to have acquired considerable emotional significance for him, as if through these efforts he was attempting to atone for his brother's actions or to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The village itself, in its collective capacity, seemed to have processed the trauma of Edmund's murder in a manner that suggested both genuine moral reflection and a certain desire to return to normalcy without confronting too directly the uncomfortable truths that the case had revealed. There had been discussions regarding whether the village would implement various security measures, though these discussions had eventually concluded without any significant changes to the community's basic approach to safety and trust. There had been speculation regarding the underlying causes of Michael's desperation and crime, though these discussions had gradually diminished as other matters claimed the village's attention. Miss Marple, observing these patterns, recognized that communities often possessed a kind of psychological resilience that allowed them to incorporate trauma and tragedy into their ongoing narrative without permitting these events to fundamentally alter their basic functioning or self-perception. As spring gradually progressed toward early summer, Miss Marple found herself increasingly occupied with observations regarding the manner in which the village had managed to address Edmund's death and Michael's crime through mechanisms that included but also transcended the formal apparatus of law and justice. The vicar had incorporated reflections on forgiveness and redemption into his sermons, suggesting that the community should attempt to maintain awareness of Michael's humanity even in the context of his crime and punishment. Various charitable organizations had expanded their activities in ways that suggested an attempt to address the financial desperation that had motivated Michael's actions. Patricia Ashworth had established a small fund designed to provide assistance to village residents experiencing financial difficulties, an action that Miss Marple recognized as representing both a genuine commitment to addressing social need and a form of atonement or acknowledgement of Edmund's role in the events that had led to his death. What emerged most clearly from Miss Marple's observations during this period was recognition that the formal processes of criminal justice, while necessary and in many ways admirable, represented only one dimension of the complex processes through which communities addressed crime and its underlying causes. The identification of Michael as the murderer and his subsequent conviction and imprisonment had satisfied the legal system's requirements regarding accountability and punishment, but the deeper work of understanding, acknowledging, and addressing the social and psychological circumstances that had produced the crime remained an ongoing process that involved the entire community in its various capacities and roles. On a particularly mild afternoon in late May, some 5 months after Edmund Ashworth's death, Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage in Thornfield Village. The visitor was Patricia Ashworth, who had apparently made the deliberate decision to call upon Miss Marple in her private residence, rather than arranging an encounter in some more public setting. The significance of this choice was not lost upon Miss Marple, who recognized that Patricia's visit represented something more than a casual social call or an expression of gratitude for Miss Marple's role in resolving the circumstances of Edmund's death. Patricia, when she had settled herself in Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room and accepted the offer of tea, seemed to be engaged in the process of communicating something that required considerable courage, and that she had apparently spent considerable time contemplating before coming to Miss Marple's door. What Patricia proceeded to reveal, in the careful and deliberate fashion of someone choosing words with great precision, was that she had come to recognize through the events of the past months that Miss Marple possessed insights into the circumstances of Edmund's death that extended considerably beyond what had been formally established through the legal proceedings. Patricia did not directly accuse Miss Marple of suspecting her own involvement in Edmund's death, but the structure of her comments and the careful attention with which she observed Miss Marple's reactions suggested that she wished to communicate, in a fashion that maintained plausible deniability, her understanding that the truth of what had occurred might be considerably more complex than what had been officially established. Patricia spoke of her long marriage to Edmund, of the gradual erosion of intimacy that had characterized their relationship over the years, of her growing awareness that Edmund's refusal to assist Michael Price had not been motivated by principle, but by a kind of casual cruelty born from comfortable distance from genuine need. What Patricia was attempting to communicate, in her careful and oblique fashion, was that she had suspected, at some level, that Edmund might not survive the Christmas Eve gathering. She spoke of having noticed Michael's agitation on the evening of Christmas Eve, of having observed the particular quality of desperation that had characterized his interactions with Edmund. She suggested that she had recognized in that evening the convergence of circumstances that might lead to tragedy, and that she had made a deliberate choice not to intervene, had instead allowed events to proceed according to whatever trajectory they might follow. She did not confess to knowledge of Michael's specific intentions, did not suggest that she had actively facilitated his access to Edmund's bedroom, or had been complicit in the actual perpetration of the murder. But her words and her carefully controlled manner suggested an awareness of what was about to occur, combined with a deliberate choice not to prevent it. Miss Marple listened to this communication with the sort of careful attention that she brought to bear on all human revelations, her tea growing cold beside her, her knitting a bandeau, Ned in her lap. When Patricia had finally concluded her carefully constructed narrative, Miss Marple was silent for a considerable period, her small frame upright in her chair, her eyes focused on a point that seemed to exist somewhere beyond the physical confines of the room. When she finally spoke, her words were gentle but carried considerable weight of meaning and understanding. She acknowledged Patricia's apparent role in allowing Edmund's death to occur, or at the very least her conscious choice not to prevent what she had suspected might be about to happen. She recognized that Patricia had apparently come to Miss Marple seeking something that might be described as understanding, absolution, or perhaps merely acknowledgement that her actions, while perhaps morally questionable, were comprehensible in the context of her complex and unsatisfying marriage. Miss Marple then engaged Patricia in a conversation that extended considerably beyond the immediate matter of Edmund's death and addressed instead the broader questions regarding responsibility, complicity, and the degree to which individuals were obligated to prevent tragic outcomes when they possessed awareness that such outcomes might be approaching. She suggested to Patricia that while the law would almost certainly never establish any formal case against her, the more significant judgment would be the internal one that Patricia would carry with her for the remainder of her life, the knowledge of having chosen not to intervene at a moment when intervention might have prevented tragedy. She pointed out that this burden of knowledge, this awareness of complicity through inaction, was arguably a more significant punishment than anything the legal system could impose. What emerged from this conversation was Miss Marple's gradual realization that the case of Edmund Ashworth's death contained layers of complexity and moral ambiguity that the formal legal proceedings had not addressed, and that perhaps could not be addressed through institutional mechanisms. Michael Price had committed the actual murder, had administered the injection that had triggered Edmund's fatal cardiac event, and had been appropriately convicted and imprisoned for this crime. Yet the circumstances that had motivated Michael's desperation, Edmund's refusal to provide assistance, Patricia's apparent knowledge of what might be about to occur, but her deliberate choice not to intervene, all of these elements had contributed to the final outcome in ways that the law could not adequately measure or address. Miss Marple recognized that her investigation of Edmund's death had revealed not merely the identity of the murderer, but the complex web of human relationships and moral failures that had produced the conditions under which murder became possible. She had come to understand that crime in small communities was rarely the product of simple evil or moral depravity, but was instead typically the manifestation of accumulated failures of compassion, understanding, and genuine engagement with the struggles of others. Edmund had failed to recognize Michael's genuine desperation and had responded with distance rather than assistance. Patricia had apparently recognized that something terrible might be about to occur, but had chosen not to prevent it. The community itself had failed to recognize Michael's deteriorating circumstances and had allowed his desperation to reach a point where violence seemed to him to be a reasonable response to rejection. As Patricia departed from Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of justice and the manner in which formal legal proceedings, while necessary and important, nevertheless remained fundamentally limited in their ability to address the deeper moral and psychological dimensions of crime. Michael Price would spend many years in prison, presumably paying through long incarceration for the act of murder that he had perpetrated. Yet this punishment would not restore Edmund to life, would not undo the suffering that his death had caused to those connected with him, and would not address the structural failures that had contributed to the tragedy. Patricia Ashworth would carry forward the knowledge of her own complicity through inaction, a burden that she would presumably bear for the remainder of her life, paying through internal suffering for her failure to intervene at a crucial moment. The village of Thornfield, having processed the shock of Edmund's murder and Michael's conviction, had gradually returned to its patterns of ordinary life. Yet something fundamental had changed in the collective awareness of the community. The comfortable assumption that violence and tragedy were matters that occurred elsewhere, that small English villages were somehow insulated from the darker dimensions of human nature, had been permanently altered. The residents of Thornfield now possessed awareness that murder could occur in their midst, that desperation could drive ordinary people to extraordinary violence, and that the structures of community that seemed to provide safety and stability were considerably more fragile than they had previously appeared. Miss Marple, sitting alone in her cottage, as the evening light gradually faded and the shadows lengthened across her sitting room, found herself reflecting on what she had learned through this investigation and what it suggested regarding the nature of human society and the possibilities and limitations of justice. She had identified the murderer, had understood his motivations, had witnessed his conviction and imprisonment. Yet she recognized that the truth of what had occurred extended considerably beyond what any legal proceeding could establish or address. She had come to understand, with the sort of weary wisdom that comes from many decades of careful observation of human nature, that the work of genuine justice extended far beyond the identification and punishment of those who perpetrated crimes, and that true prevention of violence required engagement with the human suffering, desperation, and moral failures that produced the conditions under which violence became possible. As night fell over Thornfield, and the village gradually settled into the quiet rhythms that characterized the evening hours, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking with their familiar rhythm as she worked on a shawl that she had begun many weeks previously. The clicking of the needles seemed to mark the passage of time, each stitch accumulating into larger patterns, each row building upon previous rows, the gradual construction of something that would eventually become complete and whole. In much the same fashion, Miss Marple reflected, the investigation of Edmund's death had proceeded, small observations accumulating into patterns, individual pieces of evidence combining to create a comprehensive understanding of what had occurred and why. Yet unlike the shawl, which would eventually be finished and laid aside, the deeper understanding of human nature and social dynamics that this case had revealed would remain with her, would continue to inform her observations and her interactions with the world around her, would become part of the accumulated wisdom that she carried forward into whatever remainder of her life still lay ahead. The case of Edmund Ashworth's death was, in the formal sense, closed. Michael Price was in prison. Patricia Ashworth had inherited her husband's estate and had begun the process of constructing a life that was independent of his influence. The village had returned to normalcy. Justice, in its legal and institutional manifestations, had been achieved. Yet Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage surrounded by the evidence of her long life and her many years of careful observation, recognized that the deeper truths of the case, the moral complexities and human failures that had produced Edmund's death, would remain with her as a permanent record of what she had learned regarding the nature of human nature, the fragility of community, and the limitations of any system of justice that focused solely on identifying and punishing wrongdoing, while neglecting to address the underlying conditions that made wrongdoing possible. This recognition, born of decades of observation and reflection, was perhaps the most valuable insight that any investigation could provide, and it was one that Miss Marple carried forward into the quiet evenings of her life in Thornfield Village, contemplating the endless complexity of human behavior and the endless need for compassion, understanding, and genuine engagement with the struggles of others.